Joining me this week is an author, a columnist, and a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. Don Watkins, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Good to be here.
Ayn Rand. You say the name Ayn Rand, people go completely bananas. Why is that?
Well, I mean, she challenges basically most of the ideas that people hold dear. I mean, for people on the left, of course, she's for capitalism. For people who are, quote, on the right, she's against religion. And for everybody, she's challenging the idea that self-sacrifice is the essence of morality. So, I mean, it's easy to make enemies if you have those sorts of views.
Yeah. So the objectivist, or you know what, Al, before I even preface this with any of my thoughts on objectivism, tell me what objectivism is.
So objectivism is a philosophy, and I mean, you can think of a philosophy as your basic framework for integrating your knowledge and your action. And so the idea is that, like, we have to make sense of the world that we're living in and trying to govern ourselves through. Like, what should I be trying to achieve in my life? How am I going to try to achieve it? And then how can I gain knowledge in order to do it? And that's what a philosophy is giving you. And we all have kind of like implicit answers to that, right? We all have sort of our kind of attitudes about, you know, the kind of person, what do you regard as important in life? What are you going to take as a convincing argument? What is your basic view of human nature? Are we driven by kind of desires and emotions? Are we beings who can govern ourselves by reason? Like, these are questions that we can't escape having a view on, even to like get out of bed and go to work. But the question that you face then is, are you going to really try to arrive at a view rationally, methodically, that you can logically justify and that is coherent, or are you just going to let this kind of grab bag that you've assembled over the course of your life guide you, which really means, are you going to be out of control? And so her particular take on philosophy, I mean, the way she boiled it down is that she stood for reason, self-interest, rational self-interest, and laissez-faire capitalism. But the way I like to think about it is more that the real essence of it is living a life rationally and productively. And then what are the requirements for that politically? And then what are the assumptions underlying that at a metaphysical level in terms of what kind of world we live in? But the real core of her vision is that, like, make something in your life. Go out there, be creative, create something beautiful, and do it by using reason. And I think that's just such an empowering framework.
I've had the co-author of your book, Yaron Brook, on this show, and even when I just said I was going to have him on the show, the reaction that people, oh, Ayn Rand, you know, it's selfish and evil and capitalism and all that stuff. So I assume a lot of your work just has to be extricating yourself from people's preconceived notions, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that, but I mean, I actually find it as an advantage and empowering. I think most what people do that on the surface seems like it's intended to be persuasive is not actually intended to be persuasive. People can appeal to existing tribes, right? I'm going to appeal to the conservative tribe, and then I'm going to become successful by, you know, taking the best pot shots, or I'm going to appeal to my liberal tribe. When you have a view that's very outside the mainstream, and if you want to not just talk to your 5 friends in a closet, now thankfully there's more Ayn Rand supporters than 5,
yeah.
But when you're that outside the mainstream, you have to think really deeply, like, what do other people believe? What are their best arguments for it? Can I really answer those arguments? And so I think it really motivates you. I don't find it demotivating. I find it kind of like a challenge to rise to. How can I really think about why is it that people disagree with these views, and then how can I overcome it, given that, like, I really see that these views are true. They do help you understand the world and achieve happiness in your life.
Yeah. What do you do as a fellow to the Ayn Rand Institute? What does a fellow actually do?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a really odd title, like, oh, so you're a nice fellow.
Yeah, you're a fella.
I mean, the
All
way
right.
I think about it is that I get paid to have opinions and then tell people about them. But it really is, it's taking a philosophic framework and using it to illuminate the issues that are most vital to understanding human life. And in particular, my focus is on business. And part of that is the political side of it. What are the requirements for people to be able to produce the material wealth that all our lives depend on? And then, but at a deeper level, the essence of my career is really about justice for producers. So it's that these are people who create the values whether it's businessmen who create the material values, whether it's scientists who discover the fundamental knowledge that guides our lives, whether it's artists who create enormous spiritual values. I think particularly towards businessmen, there's been this real persecution, and I regard it as a terrible injustice. And so I view a lot of what my work is about as driven by the idea of here's good people being persecuted in a really unjust way, and most people regard that as right, and I regard it as really, really wrong.
Yeah, what do you think that's about, this sort of need? I mean, you see this in the mainstream all the time. We constantly demonize business. We demonize Wall Street. Now, I would argue Wall Street has done plenty of things wrong, and we shouldn't have just unfettered, complete craziness that they often give us. But what do you think that constant demonization of business is really about?
I mean, I think it occurs on a number of different levels. But I think one of the most alarming reasons that it occurs is that Ayn Rand had this point that anybody who wants power needs a scapegoat. You need somebody who can take the blame for the sins, and then you give them power to fight that villain. And I mean, you can see this in the rise of any dictatorship, but it happens even in a country like ours that is still predominantly, or in many ways, free. It's that people who want power and people want to push their agenda. Yeah, exactly. They need scapegoats, and businessmen make a perfect scapegoat precisely because if we've been taught that the essence of morality is selflessness, well, whatever you can say about a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates, they're certainly not selfless. I mean, they're making lots of money, they're doing what they love, they're putting out products that they think are going to outdo the competition, so we conclude, well, they're selfish. Well, what have we been taught about selfishness? Well, it's that it is trampling over people, it's sacrificing over people. We have no category of the producer. The producer, the person who creates for his own benefit, for his own joy, and for furthering his own goals, but isn't trampling over others and isn't selflessly sacrificing himself. And so what happens, because we don't have the category of producer, who else do we put in the categories of selfish? We put Steve Jobs, we put Bill Gates. Well, we also we also put a Bernie Madoff, an Al Capone, the people who are slitting other people's throats, picking their pockets, and destroying their lives. Mm-hmm. And so we subtly equate those two. And one of the ways that this works out in practice is that then when we see a businessman who turns out to be a fraud, say, somebody like Madoff on Wall Street, we don't conclude the way that we would if a teacher committed a crime. Oh, there's a person who was a criminal and had a certain kind of job. Right. We say, this is proof that all businessmen are corrupt. And it makes sense because we view the profit motive. In effect, we say, look, there's a certain kind of motive. I want more, more, and more for me, and I don't care how I get it. Mm-hmm. Some people get it by selling products. Other people get it by picking each other's pockets. Some people get it, through pillage and total destruction. But it's all on the same spectrum. It's all the same drive. It's all the same desires that are animating these people. And part of what I think, if you actually think about it deeply, that is not true at all. Steve Jobs' motivation for creating beautiful products in a great company, that has nothing to do with the motivation of a Bernie Madoff who was trying to prove that he was a big shot and prove that he was a great, intelligent investor, rather than actually enjoying being a real investor. And so you need to separate those two motives, and we don't. Yeah,
what do you make of the idea that we also sort of we demonize some of these people and then we lionize some of them, like Steve Jobs, for example. I mean, Apple right now, they still outsource a ton of their work, but people on the left have no problem with that, right? I mean, that doesn't seem to be a problem. Everyone thinks Apple's so great. They're made in Cupertino, or what do they say, designed in Cupertino and made in China.
Well, yeah, but notice that they actually have taken a lot of heat. There was a whole slew of stories about the state of the factories in China. Never mind that people came to those factories because they were way better than the farms that they basically were living in poverty on. But
right, that always seems to get lost in this, that these people actually do want these jobs.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, we cite in the book a researcher who went there and spent time with the women in these factories, predominantly women, and they were not complaining about conditions that you or I would find deplorable because you always judge things by your best option available. And if your next best option available is to basically live on a farm where you have zero opportunity, then this is a step in the right direction. Now, I think we should want it to be better, and the way that it gets better is more freedom in China and freedom to immigrate to a place like the United States. It doesn't get better by just destroying an opportunity. But if we're talking about the view of Steve Jobs, in many ways he's the exception that proves the rule, because he's so clearly perceived, or was perceived, as an artist more than a businessman. And it was when he was seen as a businessman making business-oriented decisions, say, for instance, how much they were going to charge for the original iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he took the same heat as the rest of them. The book deal that he got slapped down with antitrust. Now that mostly played out after his death, but nevertheless, to the extent that people saw him as a businessman, he tended to fall into the same bucket.
That's interesting. So we like the innovator, the person that was coming up with the ideas, but the same guy who was leading the business practices, once that sort of came to light, then that hurt his image.
That's right. But in fact, it's part of the same motive, that these are people who love to build things. And if you think, like, what is the meaning of life? I think part of Ayn Rand's answer, or a way to think about her answer, it's that feeling of craftsmanship. When you're doing something that you regard as true and important and good, and that kind of experience you have when you're just focused on it, embedding it, and building something amazing, like, that is the meaning of life, because that's how you support your own life, that's how you achieve your own goals, and just the experience of that is so empowering and good that, like, if that's your view of what it means to be selfish, first of all, you'll never put a swindler or Madoff in that category, and second of all, it's really hard to see how that is bad. It's very hard to see that is something negative for human life, when really it's really the essence of what gets us out of bed in the morning.
Is that the best argument for small government that there is? Because nobody that's working for government wakes up and thinks that they own this and can, by working harder, you're sort of dulled into, you'll rise up and you'll get these raises and all those things, but you don't own it. It's not yours. Versus someone that goes out there and starts a small business and will have all the success and all the failures that come with that, but that's what life's all about.
I mean, the best argument is what's required for all of us to be able to make and build the kind of life that we want to live. And I think that if you really think deeply about the kind of life you should want to live, a virtuous life, it should be centered around productiveness. It should be centered around creating things that you regard as important and beautiful. But the only way that you can have that and have it on a massive scale, and then have innovators arise who don't just do it, but do it at a level that changes the way that we live and work, the only way you do that is if you have a society where I cannot stop you from living the kind of life that you want, from acting on your judgment, acting on your own independent initiative. Because look, we don't need the government to protect people doing popular things. We don't need the government to protect people who are doing things that everybody approves of or advocating ideas that everybody agrees with. We need the government precisely to protect the outsider, the minority, the innovator. And the only way you can do that is if you really stand for rights on principle. The idea that the only purpose of government is to protect the freedom of the individual to make his own choices and pursue his own happiness. And that's really the kind of connection. That Ayn Rand has a view of what the moral life is, and her view is you can't force people to do that. You can't force people to be creative, to be rational, but you can protect everybody's freedom to make the choice to be creative and rational.
What argument do you hear the most pushing back on these ideas? What's the thing that you hear?
I mean,
whether you agree with it or not, I suspect you don't, but what do you hear usually if you're out there and you're pushing these ideas?
Well, I mean, if you mean on a political level, I think, certainly the inequality campaign and the idea that, look, what you're talking about is a dog-eat-dog one where the rich and powerful get more rich and powerful and take advantage of everybody else. I mean, it's that whole idea. It's the idea
that you're just unleashing selfishness, sort of.
You're unleashing selfishness, but it'll often be put in terms of power. It's the idea that what you're doing is you are crafting a system that's made for the powerful, that's made for the able at the expense of the weak. And so I think that sort of objection it really is the most common one. It has so many iterations. It comes up in every sort of debate you can think of. The minimum wage debate, it's you're privileging the rich against the poor. It's you don't care about the poor. I mean, it comes up in the debate over, I mean, in basically every sort of debate you can think of it. whether it's, should we have Dodd-Frank? Are we going to, allow the big, powerful banks to control us? Are we going to rein them in for the sake of everyone? That sort of perspective, I think, it is related to the idea of selfishness, because it's the powerful people driven by their selfish urges rather than the public good. So what we need to do is give enormous political power to people like Paul Krugman and people like Barack Obama, who allegedly are out for the public good instead of their own self-interest.
But you're saying they might actually be out for their self-interest?
Well, no. What they're out for is they're not out for their rational self-interest. So I think power lust, you can say let me put it differently. Selfishness in Ayn Rand's conception is not a motive. It's not like an emotion or a drive. It's a goal. It's a moral standard that you should use to select your actions. So for instance, let's take a kind of subset of it, which is health. Would you say everybody's pursuing their health? Well, no, clearly we can see people who don't think about their health at all.
Right.
And there's certain people who do think about it and say, you know what, I'm a foodie. To me, it's much more important to just get, the best food I'm gonna have, and that's what it means in life. And if I gain a little weight and if I die 5 years sooner, who the heck wants to live if you don't get to eat, a bunch of cupcakes throughout your life?
Right.
But selfishness in her view is a kind of goal, but if you take it seriously as a goal, you have to think about the means for it. And you can't get to that goal doing whatever you feel like any more than you can get to health doing whatever you feel like doing. So it's something that has to be thought of scientifically, and the science that answers the question of what does your interest genuinely consist of, that is the job of morality. And so, that to me is what, if you're going to ask at the end of the day, what matters to me, it's that question of how do you live a virtuous life? And the reason that you should be concerned with living a virtuous life is because your happiness in life depends on it.
Right, so we usually don't think of these things traditionally in the same sentence, sort of selfishly living and how that can be virtuous. But I think you would argue that if you were truly living a selfish life for yourself the right way, you would self-regulate, right? Like you would do the things that you wouldn't pollute the lake in your neighborhood just so you could make more money because you know that you like that lake, or your neighbors like that lake, or you like to go swimming every now and again. That there's a self-regulating in it that comes from the self and not from the government. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, think about it this way. Like, you have kids, and you have to give them advice on how to live their lives, and you want the best for them. You want them to be happy, fulfilled, have meaning in their lives. Is your advice going to be do whatever you feel like doing? Is your advice going to be like Bernie Madoff? Like, no, that we have a sense that is not selfish. What we need is a rigorous understanding that deeply analyzes what does our self-interest consist of. Now, you threw out the contrast of like polluting your lake for money. And I think, look, money is really important, but that is so far from being the essence of life and the essence of your self-interest that to equate those two, as the critics of self-interest do, is really insane. When you think about the kind of joy and meaning that comes from creating amazing things, experiencing profound art, and having really deep relationships with people whom you admire and share values about. Like, that is the core of a selfish life. And now, certainly Ayn Rand, I think, is rare to hold a view like that, but she's not alone. We typically equate morality with selflessness. But historically, if you go back to the Greeks, they had a very similar conception that morality was supposed to be practical. It was supposed to give you real guidance on how to live the best life. And I think they got a number of things wrong. But the core of what they did get right, or at least certainly Aristotle got right, is that a life directed at your own interests and your own happiness is a life of reason. And so one way to think about what Ayn Rand is saying is set aside the issue of selfishness versus selflessness. Focus on the issue of what's good for you. What's good for you is live a life of reason, which means that you do everything in your power to understand the world so you can govern yourself through it. Don't go by emotions. Emotions are a great thing to consume. And they're not how you produce the great values of your life, but that's the reward. That's the consumption of your life is great emotions. That whole focus is really, I think, what interests her.
Yeah. So what's the difference between a pure objectivist and just a libertarian, for as much as we can define what a libertarian is.
Well, I think that's part of the problem, is it's a really vague term. I would say at one level, the easiest level to get the difference, and probably the least controversial one, the one that even libertarians would agree that there's a big difference between them and objectivism, is that they're a political ideology at best. It's telling you how should you structure a society, what's the role of government, and what should be the sort of institutions and principles regulating laws and so on. And objectivism has a view on those issues. It has, as a philosophy, it has a politics, but it is a philosophy. It's giving you guidance about how to think and how to live. And politics is, in effect, the kind of least important branch, in the sense that, like, the real cash value of philosophy is, are you happy? Is your life better than before you had it? Or if you had the wrong philosophy? And so libertarianism, at the minimum difference, is simply that it doesn't comment on deeper philosophic issues. Now, libertarianism as an ideology that arose really during the 70s and was pioneered by Murray Rothbard, which is a more delimited subset of the people who call them libertarians. Now, they were anti-ideology. They basically said libertarianism means that it can be defended on any philosophic basis. So we don't care whether you're a social justice warrior, egalitarian who wants to cut down the successful. We don't care whether you're a fundamentalist Islamic totalitarian. Freedom's great for everybody. It helps everybody achieve their goals. And so it was rabidly anti-ideology.
Right.
I don't think all libertarians hold that. You talk about being a classical liberal, and I think that's a much healthier kind of orientation, because if you look at the classical liberals, they were interested in political views, but from a certain philosophic perspective. Now, they disagreed on a lot, but what you can say is, at minimum, they saw themselves as being pro-reason, because this arose during the Enlightenment, and it was the idea of your enlightenment comes from reason, from using your mind. And they, even though they disagreed on what reason was, how efficacious was it, they had a commitment to reason and to persuasive argument via reason. Versus what? Well, versus faith, obedience to an authority. And then they were individualists. They valued the individual. They thought that that when we get to political issues, it all has to be from the perspective of what's good for each and every individual. It was not the kind of divide people up into groups and which group should hold power over others and everything. That's what they were tossing away. And so you can say they're individualists as against what? Well, as against authoritarians. So what they were against, both at an epistemological level, at a level of knowledge, was obedience to an authority. And what they were against at an ethical and political level was obedience to authority. It was enshrining individuals, but they had a real concern with these deeper philosophic issues. And it was only because they had that deeper philosophy that they were able to be successful in politics.
Yeah, so objectivists really are kind of put in the strange situation that I find myself in as a classical liberal these days, where, as you said at the beginning, the left doesn't like capitalism, and the right doesn't like objectivism because Ayn Rand was against religion. And this is a strange middle ground to be put in. Is there anyone politically right now in America that's operating on these guidelines, do you think? On close to objectivist guidelines?
There's definitely people who I think are really good on sort of individual issues. But like, for instance, there's no good label for what I think I stand for politically. I think laissez-faire capitalism is a good label, but there's no kind of like organized group or even semi-organized group. I think libertarian, classical, liberal, at most these kind of have vague, big tent sorts of meanings today.
Right. And unfortunately, we don't have much institutional power right now. I think that's changing a little bit, possibly, but at the moment, we don't.
But no, I think it is a minority. Even the broader conception of classical liberal is a minority, because we talk about classical liberalism comes out of the Enlightenment. Well, there was an anti-Enlightenment. There was a movement, and it really solidified with the philosopher Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century. And the kind of the epitome of it today is the social justice warriors, the postmodernist philosophers who really, I think, laid most of the groundwork for them. But there was a turn away from the Enlightenment, and it's really affected virtually everybody today. And I think if you look at Americans, they're kind of a mixture of what Ayn Rand called a sense of life enlightenment sense of, don't push me around. I want to live my life. I care about the pursuit of happiness. I'm going to go by common sense, not follow some authority. So they have kind of some remnants of the Enlightenment, but particularly if you look at the education, the schools, they are preaching the most virulently anti-reason, anti-individualist, pro-authoritarian sort of ideas. I mean, I don't have to tell you and your viewers this.
Yeah.
And so I think it's no surprise that people who object to those trends are in the minority.
So in a bizarre way, do you see Trump, who certainly is not an objectivist, and it's a little confusing as to how much he's going to rein back government, or is all this stuff with trade, just by putting more tariffs on, that's certainly not laissez-faire economics the way you would probably want. Do you think we're at a strange crossroads where the social justice warriors took a major hit by Trump winning, and yet we don't know what we have really with Trump? So do you view that as sort of an opportunity to get some of these ideas out there? Because it's just a mixed bag, basically, at the moment.
You could say it's potentially an opportunity, but I see it more as, if you look at kind of the historical development of any sort of society, including even subcultures, there's a tendency to bounce back and forth between two variants of something bad. So, for instance, Nietzsche would talk about how in his time there was kind of this alternative that we were going to see between nihilism and authoritarianism. And now he saw this as, being a result of the death of religion from the Enlightenment, and then the death of the Enlightenment because they couldn't supply a rational code of morality. But it was that there's going to be an oscillation between kind of destruction and control. And I think what we're seeing right now is one kind of form of that. It's that people are fed up with what we've been experiencing, the kind of direction that we've been heading. And they're looking for an alternative. But are they looking rationally? Or are they looking for somebody who promises that, hey, just give me power and I'll do what's good for you. Mm-hmm. I'll do what's good for, what will make America great again. What worries me is I see us leaping from what people see as kind of the nihilistic, statist so-called left to an authoritarian nationalist alternative. And I think those are no alternatives. At the end of the day, it's two variants of trying to control their people's life and money. Now that doesn't mean, let me just say as a caveat, my point is not that Trump won't do some things that I would, on a specific issue say, yeah, I'm glad that thing would be done.
Right, so for example, if he lowered taxes, you would probably be for that. Generally speaking.
Although I'd rather he focus on reducing regulation, which he has talked about, but who knows, how much stock you can put in that? Not a lot. But yes, so there are things that I think he could do in specific that are good. But what worries me is that I think part of his appeal was precisely the idea of people thinking, well, if we give this guy power, I don't know exactly what he's going to do, but he's going to use it for people like us. That is a very dangerous route for a country to go down.
Yeah. In a weird way, could Trump sort of be an objectivist gone slightly wrong in that it seems like he has some of the components that you're talking about. Selfish in that he's living for himself and his family and his business and those things. Now, we don't know what the moral part is, right? What that piece of it is. So that's sort of, he's got some of the components you must like, right?
I would say emphatically no.
Really?
So I don't think he's selfish in any way.
Really?
Ayn Rand has an essay called Selfishness Without a Self. And what it is, she's looking at this phenomenon of the sort of people who basically, they don't think in the way that we talked about, well, what objectively is good for me? What rationally can I justify as in my long-range interest? They basically tell themselves, whatever I do is good, and because I'm me, right? And that's not selfishness, that's really kind of childishness, and it's actually the kind of psychology that drives somebody like a Bernie Madoff. It's that they're driven purely by emotion, and the number one emotion that they feel is a combination of fear and kind of self-loathing. And that's why here's a guy who couldn't take criticism and feels he has to lash out at his enemies because he has no self-esteem, no self-confidence. Nobody with genuine self-esteem which comes from living a rational, productive, virtuous life. Nobody would be so obsessed with getting the approval of others and lashing out at people who give them disapproval. So, I mean, my view is that as a human being, and all indications I've seen point to there's a really pathetic, nothing under that shell of boisterousness. Like, that is definitely not the symbol of what I stand for. And again, to put the stress on it, this is certainly not somebody who's pro-reason. He's incoherent trying to make an argument. So at a fundamental level, no.
Right. I guess I meant purely at like the idea of the business level of doing for himself and his family in business, yes, but then missing the components. I mean, I understand with the thrust of the essay you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, and even that, it's a real question. I think he's a very good marketer, and certainly, deserves credit for his prowess at marketing. But as a business leader, I think, there's more an argument that he falls into the category of what Ayn Rand, or what today would often be called, cronyist, a person who's really good at playing the political system and getting special favors. Ayn Rand put it as the phenomenon of pool peddling. It's that when you have a government that's not limited in its powers, it has enormous privileges it can give out and then special penalties that it can give out. And then what you get is people who are really good at playing the game and who rise rather than through productive achievement, they rise through being able to, rub elbows with the right people.